Hey everyone, tonight we're going somewhere that most history classes never bother to take you. We're going to the Americas, not in 1492, not when the ships arrived, but a full century before any of that. We're going to the year 1400, and we're going to walk through a world that was very much alive, very much organized, and absolutely nothing like the empty wilderness that so many of us were quietly taught to imagine. Before you settle in, if you enjoy what I do here on History to Unwind, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely get something out of it. No pressure, only gratitude. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I always love seeing where in the world our little community is settling in for the night. Maybe you're watching from somewhere in the Americas, maybe from somewhere far away. And either way, I think tonight's story will feel different from anything you've heard before. Now dim the lights if you haven't already. Maybe pull a blanket closer, and let's ease into this together, because the story we're about to tell is one that history has been keeping quiet for a very long time. And it deserves to be told with the detail and the care it's never quite received. Let's start with the most persistent myth in all of American history. The idea that before Columbus, this continent was essentially empty, that it was a pristine, untouched wilderness, a kind of Eden waiting quietly in the dark for someone to arrive and bring it into the light of civilization. This idea is not just wrong, it is spectacularly, almost cosmically wrong. When Columbus stepped ashore in 1492, he was not discovering an empty world. He was walking into one of the most populated regions on Earth. Scholars' estimates vary widely and the debate is ongoing, but many place the pre-contact population of the Western Hemisphere somewhere in the tens of millions, with North America and Canada home to several million people at minimum, a number that grows in some estimates to 5, 7, or even more million, depending on the methodology used. What all serious researchers agree on is that this continent was home to a great many people, and that the scale of habitation was vastly larger than the empty wilderness story ever acknowledged. That rough population would have made North America, at the time, comparable in scale to the more populated corners of medieval Europe. These were not scattered bands of hunters wandering through untouched forest. These were farmers and architects and diplomats and merchants, people who watched the sky carefully and tracked the seasons with remarkable precision. These were people who had been building, governing, farming, trading, debating, grieving, celebrating and creating for thousands of years before any European ship crossed the Atlantic. And what they had built by the year 1400 was remarkable in ways that we are only beginning to fully understand. Let me take you somewhere specific. Picture the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers in what is now the state of Illinois, on a cool autumn morning around the year 1050. Standing on a ridge overlooking the floodplain, you would see something that would stop you cold. Something that would rewrite everything you thought you knew about who lived here. You would see a city, not a village, not a camp, a city with a population somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people at its peak, covering an area of about 6 square miles, dominated by a central earthen mound that rose 100 feet into the sky. This was Cahokia, and at its height, it was one of the largest cities in the world. It was larger than London at the same time. It was larger than any city in North America until Philadelphia surpassed it around 1800. Cahokia had neighborhoods and districts. It had a central plaza, larger than 50 football fields, where public ceremonies drew crowds from across the region. It had elaborate wooden palisades, specialized craft districts where artisans worked copper and shaped ceramite, and a sophisticated astronomical structure that archaeologists call Woodhenge, a series of large timber posts arranged to mark the solstices and the equinoxes with remarkable precision. Someone here was watching the sky with great care, tracking the movements of the sun with a precision that allowed them to mark the solstices and equinoxes reliably year after year, and they built monuments to that understanding. By the year 1400, Cahokia had already declined from its greatest heights, likely due to a combination of agricultural stress, deforestation, and climate shifts that made the river bottomlands less productive. But the story of Cahokia is not really a story of one city. It is a story of what was possible across this entire continent, of the scale and sophistication of indigenous civilization when it was given room to breathe and grow. And Cahokia was not alone. Across the continent in the year 1400, cities, towns, and villages of every scale and character were humming with life. In the southwest, the Pueblo peoples lived in multi-story stone and adobe apartment complexes that had been occupied for centuries. In the northeast, Iroquois longhouses sheltered entire extended families under one roof, within communities that stretched for miles. In the Pacific Northwest, cedar plank houses as large as small warehouses lined the shores of rivers thick with salmon. Across the southeast, mound-building cultures were still active. In the Mississippi Valley, agriculture had transformed the landscape into one of the most productive food systems on the continent. This was the world before Columbus. It was not waiting to be discovered. It was already completely, magnificently here. Now, to really understand that world, you need to understand the land itself. Because one of the greatest misconceptions we carry about pre-Columbian America is that the landscapes European explorers encountered when they arrived were natural, untouched, primeval. The thick forests, the vast prairies, the open woodlands full of game. Surely that was how the land had always been. Except it wasn't. Much of the landscape that greeted European explorers was a managed landscape, the product of thousands of years of deliberate human intervention. And the primary tool that indigenous peoples used to manage that landscape was fire. Controlled burning was perhaps the most sophisticated environmental management practice in human history, and it was practiced at scale across most of North America for thousands of years before European contact. The Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee in the northeast, the Muskogee and the Cherokee in the southeast, the Blackfoot and the Lakota on the Great Plains, the Chinook and the Tillamook in the Pacific Northwest. Dozens and dozens of distinct cultures, all using fire as a tool for shaping the land in ways that served their needs while maintaining its long-term health. What did controlled burning actually accomplish? Picture a dense forest choked with undergrowth, deadfall, and dry brush, where deer can barely move and where light cannot reach the ground. Now picture that same forest after a careful, low-intensity burn moves through it in early spring, clearing the accumulated debris without destroying the mature trees, allowing grass and berries and medicinal plants to flourish in the new openings, creating the kind of open, park-like forest that many early European explorers described with wonder when they arrived. The woods are open and pleasant, wrote one English colonist in Virginia. The grass grows everywhere. He thought he was describing nature. He was describing a garden. Fire was used to drive game during hunts, concentrating deer, elk, and bison into areas where hunters could intercept them. Because one of the greatest misconceptions we carry about pre-Columbian America is that the landscapes European explorers encountered when they arrived were natural, untouched, primeval. The thick forests, the vast prairies, the open woodlands full of game. Surely that was how the land had always been. Except it wasn't. Much of the landscape that greeted European explorers was a managed landscape, the product of thousands of years of deliberate human intervention. And the primary tool that indigenous peoples used to manage that landscape was fire. Controlled burning was perhaps the most sophisticated environmental management practice in human history, and it was practiced at scale across most of North America for thousands of years before European contact. The Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee in the northeast, the Muskogee and the Cherokee in the southeast, the Blackfoot and the Lakota on the Great Plains, the Chinook and the Tillamook in the Pacific Northwest. Dozens and dozens of distinct cultures, all using fire as a tool for shaping the land in ways that served their needs while maintaining its long-term health. What did controlled burning actually accomplish? Picture a dense forest choked with undergrowth, deadfall, and dry brush, where deer can barely move and where light cannot reach the ground. Now picture that same forest after a careful, low-intensity burn moves through it in early spring, clearing the accumulated debris without destroying the mature trees, allowing grass and berries and medicinal plants to flourish in the new openings, creating the kind of open, park-like forest that many early European explorers described with wonder when they arrived. "The woods are open and pleasant," wrote one English colonist in Virginia. "The grass grows everywhere." He thought he was describing nature. He was describing a garden. Fire was used to drive game during hunts, concentrating deer, elk, and bison into areas where hunters could intercept them. It was used to clear land for planting and to maintain the berry patches, camas fields, and other plant resources that were central to many diets. It was used to send signals across long distances and to protect villages by creating fire breaks. Researchers at the Jemez Pueblo in New Mexico have documented 27 distinct uses for fire and fuel wood within that single community alone. The ecological consequences of this burning were profound and positive. The open, diverse habitats created by regular burning supported far greater biodiversity than the dense, closed forests that grew up when burning stopped. The prairies of the Great Plains, which stretched across the middle of the continent like a sea of grass and supported vast herds of bison, were in large part the product of regular burning by the peoples who lived there. When indigenous burning practices were suppressed after European contact, and in many places the United States government formally prohibited them as late as 1911, the forests became denser, more prone to catastrophic wildfire, and less productive as habitat. We are still dealing with the ecological consequences of that suppression today. There is ongoing scholarly debate about the relative contributions of human burning versus natural climate patterns in shaping pre-contact landscapes, and researchers are appropriately cautious about overstating any single factor. But the evidence is now overwhelming that indigenous burning played a major and intentional role in shaping the continent that Europeans encountered. The wilderness they saw was, in significant part, a creation. Now let's talk about food, because what indigenous peoples grew in this landscape is another area where the popular imagination has failed almost entirely. The most important agricultural achievement in the pre-Columbian Americas, arguably in the entire history of food, was the development and spread of the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, planted together in a single garden system that is a masterwork of ecological engineering. The genius of the three sisters is that the three plants work together in ways that amplify the productivity and resilience of each. Corn grows tall and provides a natural trellis for the beans to climb, which means the beans don't need separate support structures. The beans, as legumes, fix nitrogen from the air and deposit it in the soil, effectively fertilizing the corn and squash around them without any human intervention. The squash spreads wide along the ground, its large leaves shading out weeds and locking in soil moisture so effectively that you barely need to weed or water the garden once it gets going. Together, the three plants also create nutritional completeness. Corn provides carbohydrates and calories, beans provide protein and the amino acids that corn lacks, and squash provides vitamins and minerals. For communities that ate this combination, malnutrition was rare. This system originated in Mesoamerica and spread northward over centuries, reaching many parts of what is now the Midwest and Northeast by around 1000 CE. Cahokia's rapid growth around 900 to 1000 CE correlates directly with the adoption of intensive maize agriculture in the Mississippi Valley. The food surplus that corn made possible is what allowed the city to grow. What fed the laborers who built those enormous earthen mounds? What supported the specialist craftspeople and traders who made Cahokia a regional center of culture and commerce? In the Northeast, the Haudenosaunee people, often called the Iroquois, planted the three sisters in long, carefully tended mound garden beds that could stretch for acres around their villages. Planting was a communal and ceremonial activity, guided by the women who held primary responsibility for agriculture in these matrilineal societies. The Garden of the Three Sisters was not just a food source. It was a living embodiment of a philosophy of reciprocity and interdependence, of three beings who each gave what the others needed and received what they lacked. Many communities had creation stories about the three sisters as living spirits, as gifts from the Creator who had placed them on Earth to sustain human life. And the careful attention given to their cultivation reflected that sacred relationship. These traditions were devastated by the forced assimilation policies of the 19th and early 20th centuries, by boarding schools that separated children from their communities and forbade the practice of traditional knowledge. By the 1930s, many of these ancient agricultural traditions had nearly vanished, but they did not vanish completely. In the past several decades, communities across North America have engaged in passionate and successful efforts to revive them. And the Three Sisters Garden is today experiencing something of a renaissance, not just in Indigenous communities, but in the broader culture as people recognize that this 1,000-year-old system may have a great deal to teach us about sustainable food production. Let me bring you closer now. Let me take you inside the texture of a single day. It is a morning in early autumn, in a Haudenosaunee village in what is now upstate New York, perhaps in the year 1420. 40 or 50 families live in this village, all of them sheltered within several enormous longhouses. The longhouses are the first thing to understand if you want to understand this world. They are not small. The average Haudenosaunee longhouse is between 60 and 100 feet long, though some of the grandest could stretch to 200 feet or more. They are built from a framework of young saplings, bent and lashed together into an arching tunnel shape, then covered with sheets of elm or birch bark that have been scraped and cured to resist rain. Along each interior wall, raised sleeping platforms provide beds for the family units, each with its own storage space below and a curtained alcove for a measure of privacy. Down the center of the longhouse runs a row of hearths, their smoke curling up and drifting out through smoke holes in the roof. In the winter, the combined body heat of dozens of people and the row of fires makes the longhouse warm even in the deepest cold. On this autumn morning, the village is waking slowly in the gray pre-dawn light. A woman tends the coals back to life, adding wood until the fire is steady, then hanging a clay pot over the flames. Inside the pot, a thick corn soup, hominy, that has been slowly cooking with dried beans and a few pieces of smoked deer meat. The smell is deep and warm and fills the longhouse completely. Children begin to stir on the sleeping platforms above. An elder coughs softly and wraps himself more tightly in a beaver skin robe. The men who are going to hunt today have already been awake for an hour. Hunting in Haudenosaunee culture was a careful, ritualized activity, not a simple matter of grabbing a bow and wandering into the forest. The hunters would have spoken quietly the night before about where the deer trails ran and which hollows held the last good acorn mast of the season. Some would have observed the small signs of the forest, the direction of the wind, the behavior of birds, that told experienced woodsmen where the animals had moved. Before setting out, there was a moment of stillness, of acknowledgement. The deer that would be taken was not just a resource, it was a relative of sorts, a being who would give itself in exchange for the proper respect shown by the hunter. This is one of the most important things to understand about the spiritual life of pre-contact Indigenous peoples across the continent, and we will come back to it in more depth later. For now, what matters is that it shaped every interaction with the natural world. From the planting of the Three Sisters, to the kindling of a controlled burn, to the drawing of a bow, the land was not a resource to be extracted. It was a community to be lived within. Back in the longhouse, the women of the household, in this matrilineal society, multiple generations of women related through the female line, along with their husbands, are now moving through the familiar morning rhythms. Children are fed first. The older girls begin helping with the cooking, and the younger ones play near the fire under the eye of a grandmother. The longhouse belongs to the women, literally and legally. If a marriage dissolved, it was the husband who moved out, back to the longhouse of his own mother's family. The children, the hearth, the stored food, all of it remained with the women. Outside the longhouse, the village spreads along a slight ridge above a river. A wooden palisade of upright logs surrounds the settlement, a practical precaution in a world where conflict between neighboring peoples could and did occur. But on this particular morning, the gates are open and people are moving freely in and out. Women walk to the gardens a short distance from the village walls, where the three sisters stand in their autumn glory. The cornstalks, tall and pale yellow now, the bean pods dry and rattling, the great orange globes of squash lying in the soil like small suns. Harvesting is a communal effort, and there is laughter and conversation among the women as they work. This village is connected to others. 10 miles away, in another clearing along another river, there is a larger community with which this one shares a clan system and reciprocal obligations. Twice a year, representatives of both villages travel to meet at a designated location to exchange news, resolve disputes, and reaffirm their relationships. The network of these relationships extends far beyond the immediate region. A person from this village who traveled to a Haudenosaunee community 200 miles away would find recognizable kinship structures, a shared language, shared stories, shared ceremonies. They would not be a stranger. They would be, in a meaningful sense, home. By noon, the hunters have not yet returned. The women who work the gardens have brought in a first portion of the harvest and are sorting it into storage baskets. A group of young men are working at the edge of the village on a new section of palisade where the old logs have begun to rot. An elder woman, one of the clan mothers, sits near the central fire and listens as two younger women bring her a question about the harvest distribution, whether the family of a recently widowed woman should receive additional support from the communal stores. The clan mother listens carefully and asks a few questions, and then gives her opinion. Her word, while not absolute, carries enormous weight. In Haudenosaunee society, the clan mothers hold one of the most important political roles imaginable: the power to nominate and to remove the chiefs who govern. The hunters return in the late afternoon with 2 deer and a wild turkey. The deer are carried in on poles, their legs lashed together, their heads hanging. A hunter whispers something to the deer as he sets it down. A word of thanks, an acknowledgement, a completion of the relationship that the hunt began. The butchering is efficient and thorough. Every part of the animal will be used. The meat for eating, the bones for tools and decoration and broth, the hide for clothing and moccasins, and the covers of drums, the sinew for bowstrings and thread. The organs prepared and eaten fresh or dried for later. Nothing is wasted, and the waste of what has given itself for your survival would be a kind of disrespect that the worldview of this community simply did not accommodate. In the evening, after the meal, people gather near the central fire. The night is growing cool, and the stars are extraordinarily bright above the smoke hole. An older man begins to tell a story. One of the old ones, one that travels far back into the time before memory, to explain something about the shape of the world or the nature of human relationships. Children who are playing at the edge of the firelight drift closer without being asked. Somewhere in another longhouse, someone is playing a drum softly. The night has a kind of gravity to it, a settled weight that feels deeply human. This is one vision of one evening in one village among hundreds of different peoples living hundreds of different kinds of lives across a continent of extraordinary diversity. Before we go further, let's sit with that diversity for a moment, because it is genuinely astonishing. In the same year that this Haudenosaunee family is gathering around their longhouse fire, a family in the Pueblo town of Acoma, in what is now New Mexico, is settling into a stone apartment that has been continuously occupied for centuries. The Pueblo peoples of the Southwest lived in permanent, multi-story stone and adobe structures that were genuinely urban in character, some of them housing thousands of people. Acoma Pueblo, perched on a sandstone mesa 357 feet above the desert floor, is today one of the oldest continuously inhabited communities in the United States. Its residents have been living there for over 1,000 years. In the Pacific Northwest, a Chinook family on the lower Columbia River lives in a cedar plank house that is 100 feet long and 25 feet wide. The interior space defined by great cedar beams and decorated with carved and painted imagery that records the family's history and its relationships with the supernatural world. The Columbia River at this time is one of the most productive salmon fisheries in the world, and the communities along its banks have developed elaborate technologies and protocols for harvesting it. Weirs, traps, dip nets, and equally elaborate social structures for managing access to this abundance, so that no one takes more than their share, and the fish are allowed to run and reproduce. On the Great Plains, the picture is more complex than many people realize. The image of Plains peoples as nomadic buffalo hunters on horseback is deeply embedded in popular culture, but it is largely a post-contact image. The horse was not present in North America before the Spanish reintroduced it in the 16th and 17th centuries. It had gone extinct in the Americas at the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago. Before the horse, life on the Great Plains involved a great deal more agriculture than most people imagine. Many Plains peoples were semi-sedentary, living in permanent villages of earth lodges for much of the year and conducting seasonal hunts on foot, often using fire and elaborate systems of pounded fences and drive lanes to direct bison herds into killing zones, where large numbers could be taken efficiently. The Mandan, Hidatsa, and Iroquois peoples along the upper Missouri River, for instance, were accomplished farmers who grew corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers in rich river-bottom soil, supplemented by bison hunting. Their earth lodge villages were substantial and durable, and they were important nodes in the continental trade networks that tied together the whole of North America in ways that still astonish researchers. And in the Southeast, the mound-building cultures of what is now Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida were creating ceremonial centers that drew people from vast hinterlands for trade, ceremony, and political negotiation. Spiro Mounds, in what is now eastern Oklahoma, was a major ceremonial and trade center where archaeologists have found goods from across the entire continent arrived and departed: copper from the Great Lakes, marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico, obsidian from the mountains of the West. The diversity of these cultures and equally elaborate social structures for managing access to this abundance, so that no one takes more than their share and the fish are allowed to run and reproduce. On the Great Plains, the picture is more complex than many people realize. The image of Plains peoples as nomadic buffalo hunters on horseback is deeply embedded in popular culture, but it is largely a post-contact image. The horse was not present in North America before the Spanish reintroduced it in the 16th and 17th centuries. It had gone extinct in the Americas at the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago. Before the horse, life on the Great Plains involved a great deal more agriculture than most people imagine. Many Plains peoples were semi-sedentary, living in permanent villages of earth lodges for much of the year and conducting seasonal hunts on foot, often using fire and elaborate systems of pounded fences and drive lanes to direct bison herds into killing zones, where large numbers could be taken efficiently. The Mandan, Hidatsa, and Iroquois peoples along the upper Missouri River, for instance, were accomplished farmers who grew corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers in rich river-bottom soil, supplemented by bison hunting. Their earth lodge villages were substantial and durable, and they were important nodes in the continental trade networks that tied together the whole of North America in ways that still astonish researchers. And in the Southeast, the mound-building cultures of what is now Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida were creating ceremonial centers that drew people from vast hinterlands for trade, ceremony, and political negotiation. Spiro Mounds, in what is now eastern Oklahoma, was a major ceremonial and trade center where archaeologists have found goods from across the entire continent arrived and departed: copper from the Great Lakes, marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico, obsidian from the mountains of the West. The diversity of these cultures in language, architecture, food, spiritual practice, social organization, and relationship with the land is one of the most remarkable things about the pre-contact world. At the time of European contact, somewhere in the range of 300 distinct languages were spoken north of the Rio Grande, belonging to dozens of completely unrelated language families. These were not dialects of a single tongue. Many of them were as different from each other as Chinese is from French. The Americas were not one world. They were hundreds of worlds, each with its own genius and its own particular way of being human. Now let's step inside the homes themselves. Because the teepee, that graceful conical structure that has become the symbol of the Indian in popular culture, was not, of course, the home of all or even most indigenous peoples. It was the home of specific cultures in specific places, and even among the peoples who used it, its widespread adoption came only after the horse transformed plains life in the 17th and 18th centuries. The classic plains teepee was an elegant, portable structure made from 10 to 30 long straight poles, usually lodgepole pine, arranged in a cone and covered with 10 to 20 carefully tanned and stitched buffalo hides. A well-made teepee was a marvel of design. It was warm in winter and cool in summer because of a ventilation system at the top that could be adjusted by moving the smoke flaps. It was waterproof. It could be put up by 2 experienced women in under an hour and taken down in less time than that. In a world where hunting camps needed to move regularly to follow the bison, the teepee's portability was not a limitation. It was a solution. The Haudenosaunee longhouse we visited earlier represents a completely different architectural tradition. Permanent, communal, built to last. The Southwest offers yet another tradition in the Pueblo apartments, multi-story structures of stone or adobe brick, sometimes built against the walls of cliff alcoves for defense and for the natural insulation that the cliff provided. Cliff Palace at Mesa Verde, built by the ancestral Pueblo people and abandoned around 1300 CE, contained more than 150 rooms and 23 kivas, the circular ceremonial rooms that served as spiritual and social centers of Pueblo life, and housed somewhere around 100 people. It is one of the most spectacular architectural achievements in North American prehistory. In the Pacific Northwest, the cedar plank houses of peoples like the Haida, Tlingit, and Chinook were permanent and substantial, their interiors divided into family areas and ceremonial spaces. The forests of the Pacific Northwest provided an extraordinary building material in red cedar, which is straight-grained, rot-resistant, and can be split into wide planks without sawing. A single massive cedar could yield enough planks to build a substantial house. The earth lodges of the Northern Plains peoples were low, dome-shaped structures built over a shallow pit, with a framework of logs covered in earth and sod. Inside, they were surprisingly comfortable, warm in winter, cool in summer, with a central fire pit and a smoke hole above. The largest earth lodges could be 40 or 50 feet in diameter and house an extended family of 30 or 40 people, with room for their horses to share the shelter in the coldest weather. The Navajo Hogan, the Wigwam and Wetu of the eastern woodlands, the Birch Bark Lodge of the Ojibwe, the Chickie of the Seminole and the Florida swamps. Each of these is a precise and elegant adaptation to the specific environment, climate, and life pattern of its makers. There is no primitive architecture here. Every one of these structures represents accumulated generations of knowledge about materials, climate, and human need. Now let's talk about government. Because what happened in the forests of what is now New York State, sometime between 1100 and 1450 CE, this was not a system of majority rule. No decision could be made that was not accepted by all the member nations. This created a slow, deliberative process that demanded patience and the arts of persuasion and compromise. A process that could be frustrating in urgent situations, but that prevented the permanent alienation of any member nation and built genuine agreement rather than mere compliance. Decisions that touched on war and peace were among the most carefully deliberated. The Confederacy had strong protocols for distinguishing between conflicts that could be resolved through diplomacy and those that could not be avoided. This structure, multiple sovereign units, each with its own internal governance, joined in a federal body for common concerns, with checks on executive authority and a mechanism for removing leaders who abused power, resonates with certain features of modern democratic governance in ways that historians have debated at length. In 1988, the United States Congress passed a resolution acknowledging the influence of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy on the framers of the American Constitution. Benjamin Franklin had explicitly cited the Iroquois example at the Albany Congress of 1754, writing that it seemed strange that 6 nations of ignorant savages, his words, reflecting his era, should be capable of forming a union that had lasted for generations, while the British colonies could not manage the same thing. Scholars debate how direct and how deep this influence actually was, and there are real differences between the Haudenosaunee system and the constitutional government that emerged in Philadelphia in 1787. The Haudenosaunee system was hereditary in certain respects, governed by clan mothers in ways that had no parallel in the American founding, and operated on principles of consensus that are quite different from majority rule. The influence is genuinely debated, and that debate belongs in the open. But what is not debated is that a working federal system, one that had maintained relative peace among formerly warring nations for centuries, existed here long before the United States did. Whatever the framers borrowed or didn't borrow, they could see it working. By 1722, the Tuscarora Nation had been admitted as a 6th member of the Confederacy, which thereafter became known as the 6 Nations. The Confederacy remained a significant political and military force in the Northeast well into the colonial period. Its alliances eagerly sought by both the British and the French. Its internal deliberations during this period were sophisticated diplomatic exercises conducted by people who were acutely aware of their strategic position and the value of their alliance to any European power. The Confederacy model was not the only sophisticated governance system in pre-contact North America, but it is the best documented and most studied across the continent. Peoples governed themselves through systems that ranged from the relatively egalitarian councils of many plains and woodland communities, where decision-making was distributed broadly, and leaders held authority mainly through demonstrated wisdom and generosity, rather than inherited position, to the more hierarchical, chiefly systems of the Southeast, where leaders could command labor and resources in ways that more closely resembled what Europeans might have recognized as government. Now, let's follow the trade routes, because there is something that still manages to astonish researchers about pre-contact North America, and it is this. We tend to imagine these communities as a series of isolated groups, each living within its own small world, rarely in contact with peoples far away. This picture is completely wrong. The evidence of archaeology tells a different story entirely, and it is a story of a continent laced together by trade routes along which materials and ideas moved across thousands of miles. Here is a single example that captures it perfectly. At archaeological sites in Ohio and Illinois, associated with what researchers call the Hopewell culture, dating to roughly 100 BCE to 500 CE, archaeologists have found obsidian, that beautiful, black, glass-like volcanic stone that was prized for making the sharpest cutting tools available in the pre-metal world. But the nearest source of obsidian to Ohio is in what is now Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming, more than 1,500 miles away. The obsidian made that journey somehow, through multiple hands, passed along in exchanges that accumulated over years and generations, until it arrived in the burial mounds of the Ohio Valley. That is not an isolated case. It is part of a pattern. Copper from the mines of the upper Great Lakes found its way into burial contexts in Louisiana, more than 1,000 miles to the south. Gulf Coast shells turned up in the archaeological record of communities in what is now Manitoba, Canada. Turquoise from the southwest appeared in the hands of traders at Cahokia, at the Spiro Mound site in eastern Oklahoma. Excavated in the early 20th century, archaeologists found a staggering concentration of goods from across the continent. Great Lakes copper, Pacific Coast shells, marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico, obsidian that geochemical analysis traced to multiple different sources, carved stone pipes, and elaborately worked textile fragments. These goods did not move by accident. They moved through established relationships, trading partnerships, diplomatic exchanges, kinship networks that connected communities across the vast distances of the continent. Goods did not have to travel from hand to hand along a single continuous route. They could pass through many intermediary communities, each adding something, each receiving something, in a cascading network of exchange that connected the whole. By around 1450 CE, researchers estimate that there were established trade centers at intervals across the continent. The Dalles on the Columbia River was one of the most important, a fishing and trading site where peoples from the coast and the interior met each year to exchange dried salmon, shell beads, canoes, and hundreds of other goods, and where multiple languages and cultural traditions intersected in a polyglot marketplace. Taos Pueblo in the southwest was another node, where Pueblo peoples traded their agricultural surplus and their turquoise for the bison robes and dried meat of the plains. What traveled along these routes was not only material goods, ideas, technologies, and spiritual practices traveled too. The spread of the Three Sisters agricultural system from Mesoamerica northward was carried by these networks. Pottery styles, architectural techniques, ceremonial practices, all of these show patterns of spread that follow the trade routes. When archaeologists find a distinctive style of pottery vessel far from the region where it was made, they are often looking at evidence of trade, of people and ideas in motion. The existence of these networks also implies something important about the social and political conditions necessary to maintain them. Long distances of relative safety, trusted intermediaries, agreements about the terms of exchange, and some mechanism for resolving disputes that arose. You do not build and maintain continental trade networks without diplomacy. The networks themselves are evidence of a vast and visible architecture of relationship and trust. Now let's talk about conflict. Any honest portrait of pre-contact North America has to include warfare, because warfare existed, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of distortion. The question is not whether indigenous peoples fought. They did, but what their warfare looked like, why it happened, and how it was understood within their own cultural frameworks. Pre-contact warfare in North America was, in most respects, quite different from the mass, decisive, territorial warfare that characterized European military history. This is not because indigenous peoples were more peaceful by nature. Human beings are human beings everywhere, but because the goals, the scale, and the cultural meaning of conflict were different. Among many woodland and eastern peoples, one of the most important contexts for warfare was what anthropologists call the mourning war, when a community lost members to disease, accident, or enemy attack. The grief that resulted was not simply a private matter. It created an obligation, a kind of spiritual debt that needed to be settled. The community might send out a war party not primarily to seize territory or destroy an enemy force, but to capture people who could be brought home and adopted into the community, filling the social roles left empty by the dead. Captives who were adopted in this way often became fully integrated members of their new community, with the name and kinship ties of the person whose place they took. Captives who were not adopted might face ritual torture and execution, which was understood within this framework as a kind of spiritual settlement, a completion of the accounting that death had opened. Women, particularly the elder women of a community, often had the power to decide the fate of captives, adoption, or death. This was one of the ways in which the political authority of women extended into the sphere of conflict. The construction of wooden palisades around many villages throughout the northeast and southeast is clear archaeological evidence that real threats of violence existed, and that communities took practical steps to defend against them. The Iroquois Confederacy, as we noted, was founded in significant part to end the cycles of blood feud between its member nations, which is itself evidence that those cycles had been real and costly. Conflict was a fact of pre-contact life, not a myth invented to justify what came later. On the plains after the horse arrived, warfare took on new characteristics that are better documented. The concept of counting coup, touching an enemy warrior in battle without killing them, often with a specially designated coup stick, is one of the best-known examples of how plains warfare was embedded in the framework of values, where personal bravery and the acknowledgement of an opponent's courage could take precedence over sheer destructiveness. A warrior who counted coup on a living, fighting enemy earned more honor than one who killed a man from a distance. This does not mean Plains warfare was not dangerous or deadly. It certainly was. But it does mean that the purposes and values embedded in it were different from those of European warfare in important ways. Diplomacy was as important as warfare, and the two were always in conversation with each other. The calumet, the ceremonial pipe, was one of the most important diplomatic instruments across a vast region of North America. Used in formal ceremonies to mark agreements, to open negotiations, to pledge peace between formerly warring groups. Wampum belts, carefully made strings and belts of white and purple shell beads, were used among the Haudenosaunee and their neighbors as mnemonic devices to record treaty terms, diplomatic messages, and historical events. Their patterns read aloud in council, as a way of invoking the agreement that the belt memorialized. Intermarriage between the families of leaders was a widespread tool of alliance building, creating kinship ties that made future conflict more complicated and future cooperation more natural. Now let's talk about something that is easy to describe clumsily, and that deserves more care than it usually receives: the spiritual life of pre-contact Indigenous peoples. The spiritual traditions of North America were as diverse as its languages and peoples. It would be deeply misleading to try to describe a single Native American religion, because no such thing exists. What does exist is a set of recurring themes and orientations that appear across many different traditions, and that offer some general windows into a shared sensibility, while remembering that every specific tradition has its own character and complexity. Perhaps the most fundamental of these recurring themes is the understanding that the world is alive, not metaphorically, but in a genuinely serious sense. Plants, animals, rivers, mountains, winds, fire. All of these are understood in many Indigenous traditions not as inert matter, but as beings with their own forms of agency, their own relationships, their own proper ways of being treated. The deer that gives itself to the hunter is a relative. The corn plant that grows from the soil is a being with its own spirit. The river that feeds the salmon run is a presence that has its own needs, and that must be respected and reciprocated. Anthropologists sometimes call this worldview animism, though that label carries its own history and limitations. What it points toward is an understanding of the cosmos as a community of persons, human and other than human, bound together in webs of relationship and obligation. Human beings are not exceptional in this community. They are participants in it, and their well-being depends on maintaining the right relationships with their other-than-human relatives. This orientation expresses itself in practices of gratitude and acknowledgement that run through daily life. The Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving Address, the Ohenton Kariwatequin, sometimes called the words before all else, is a ceremonial recitation that opens any significant gathering, moving systematically through all the beings of the natural world to greet them and give thanks. The people of the earth, the waters, the fish, the plants, the food plants, the medicinal herbs, the animals, the trees, the birds, the winds, the thunder beings, the sun, the moon, the stars, the enlightened teachers, and the Creator. It can take anywhere from a few minutes to several hours depending on the care and elaborateness of the telling. And its purpose is simply to reaffirm the relationships that hold the world together before any human business begins. This is not merely ceremonial decoration. It is a statement of ontology, of how the world fundamentally is. And it shapes everything from agricultural practice to hunting ethics to political deliberation. If the world is a community of relatives, then you owe your relatives certain things. You owe them attention, respect, reciprocity. You do not take more than you need. You do not waste what has been given. You speak carefully of beings who can hear you. Different communities celebrated this understanding in different ways. The green corn ceremony, celebrated by many southeastern peoples, including the Muskogee, the Cherokee, the Seminole, and others, was one of the most important ceremonial occasions of the year. It marked the ripening of the new corn, a moment of renewal and communal rebirthing. Old fires were extinguished, and a new fire was kindled from a sacred source. Old grievances were forgiven. Debts and disputes were cleared. The community began again from a clean place, under the protection and with the blessing of the corn, who was understood as a living being and a relative. Vision quests, extended periods of solitude, fasting, and prayer in a remote location were practiced in different forms by many peoples across the plains and woodlands, as a way for young people to establish their own direct relationship with the spirit world, to receive guidance and power from a spirit helper who would accompany them through life. The Sweat Lodge ceremony, a form of ritual purification involving steam in a small enclosed structure, was and remains one of the most widely practiced ceremonies in Indigenous North America, used for physical and spiritual cleansing, for communal prayer, and for healing. Sacred objects held enormous importance in many traditions. Medicine bundles, collections of sacred items, each with its own story and power, were carried by healers and ceremonial leaders as concentrations of spiritual presence and protection. Kachina figures among the Pueblo peoples represented the spirit beings who were believed to bring rain and well-being to the community. And their elaborately carved and painted forms were among the most remarkable art objects produced in pre-contact North America. Wampum belts recorded not just diplomatic agreements, but stories, histories, spiritual teachings. They were libraries in shell. These spiritual traditions were, of course, suppressed with great violence during the colonial period. Government policies in the United States prohibited the practice of traditional ceremonies outright for much of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The boarding school system was explicitly designed to destroy traditional spiritual knowledge by separating children from their families and forbidding them to speak their languages or practice their traditions. The damage was immense, but these traditions did not die because they were carried in the memories and the commitments of the people who practiced them, often in secret, at great personal cost. Today, those traditions are being actively revitalized across Indigenous North America, not as museum pieces or curiosities, but as living systems of meaning and practice that have sustained communities for thousands of years and that continue to offer insight and strength. Let's bring all of this together now and stand for a moment at the edge of the world that was about to change. The year is 1490, 2 years before Columbus. A continent of many millions of people is going about its life. In the longhouses of the Haudenosaunee, the clan mothers are deliberating about the next council fire. In the Pueblo towns of the Southwest, men and women are plastering the walls of their stone apartments against the winter cold. In the villages of the Southeast, the smoke of autumn fires rises through the trees. On the northern plains, hunters are reading the wind and watching the horizon for the dark mass that signals a bison herd has moved close. None of these people know what is coming. They have no word for it. There are no prophecies of the specific catastrophe that will descend with the ships. What comes will be beyond anything that any human community had faced. Because what comes is not merely an invasion, though it is that too. What comes is a biological event of almost incomprehensible scale. The peoples of the Americas had been isolated from the rest of the world's disease pool for somewhere between 15 and 20,000 years. Ever since the land bridge across what is now the Bering Strait was swallowed by rising seas after the last ice age. During those millennia, the old world had accumulated a terrible reservoir of infectious diseases. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, diphtheria, and dozens of others, against which its human populations had developed some measure of genetic and immunological resistance through generations of exposure and selection. The peoples of the Americas had no such resistance. They had never encountered these diseases, and when European contact brought them into the hemisphere, beginning in the Caribbean in 1492 and spreading from there with terrifying speed, the result was a demographic catastrophe that scholars today call the Great Dying. The best current estimates suggest that between 80 and 95% of the indigenous population of the Americas died in the century and a half following European contact. Though, as with pre-contact population figures, Scholars debate the precise numbers. What is not in dispute is the scale. This was a loss of human life almost without parallel in recorded history. The Great Dying was so complete, so catastrophic, that it literally changed the Earth's climate. Researchers have found evidence that the reforestation of agricultural land across the Americas following the collapse of indigenous populations, all those millions of acres that had been farmed and burned and managed for millennia, suddenly allowed to grow wild again, absorbed enough carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to contribute to the global cooling event known as the Little Ice Age, which reached its coldest point in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. What unfolded was a collision of disease, of power, of new empires moving through unfamiliar lands, with consequences that still echo in the present. It is not a simple story of villains and victims, though it is certainly a story of suffering. It is a story of a world encountering another world with catastrophic asymmetry and the only factor that, in that moment, mattered most: immunity. The peoples who survived did so against odds that are genuinely staggering. They carried forward what they could of their languages, their ceremonies, their knowledge, their relationships. They adapted, as human beings do, to conditions that no adaptation could fully prepare for. And they continued into the present day, into communities that are alive and complex and diverse and engage with the modern world, not as relics of the past, but as peoples with living cultures and political sovereignty and futures they are actively shaping. The world before Columbus was not a golden age without conflict or hardship. It was a human world with all the beauty and difficulty that implies. But it was also a world of remarkable achievement. In governance, in agriculture, in trade, in ecological management, in architecture, in spiritual practice. It was a world that had developed across thousands of years of ingenuity and adaptation, and it deserved to endure. Understanding the world that was lost, understanding what it actually was, and not the convenient shadow version that popular culture has so long substituted for it, is one of the most important acts of historical reckoning available to us. The peoples of this continent were not waiting to be discovered, not waiting to be civilized, not waiting for anything except the seasons and the harvests and the next council fire. They were here, fully and completely here, living lives of meaning and complexity in a world they had built and managed and understood. That is the story, and it has never really been over. If tonight's journey has given you a new way of seeing this history, if you heard something that surprised you or moved you or simply settled into a quiet part of your mind for later, I'd love to know. Tell me in the comments where you first heard about this video. Was it a friend, a recommendation from somewhere? Wandering late at night through the corners of the internet, I'm genuinely curious, and I read every one. And if this is the kind of history you want to keep exploring, the real version, the one that doesn't sand away the complexity, then like the video if it meant something to you, and subscribe if you want to come back for more. I'll be here. Sleep well. The world has many more stories waiting.